Cowboy, do you just want my body like everyone else's? The words were barely louder than the wind, yet they struck harder than any bullet Ethan Calloway had ever taken. For one endless heartbeat, the desert seemed to stop breathing. The horses stood motionless. Even the dying fire between them forgot how to crackle. Ethan looked at the Apache widow sitting against the sandstone wall, her dark eyes burning with anger, fear, and something even older than either of them. He could have answered immediately. He could have sworn before God that he had never looked at her that way. Instead, he lowered his gaze, carefully placed another piece of mesquite wood into the fire, and let the silence speak before he ever did. 3 hours earlier, the canyon had echoed with gunfire. The late afternoon sun poured molten gold across the cliffs while dust rolled like smoke beneath pounding hooves. Ethan had been following a stray steer through Broken Hawk Pass when he heard the scream. It wasn't the scream of someone fighting. It was the sound of someone who already knew no one was coming. He urged his bay gelding forward without thinking. The trail narrowed between towering walls of red stone until 4 riders burst into view. Their horses surrounded a lone Apache woman whose torn black shawl fluttered against the wind. One man reached for her wrist while another laughed as though the hunt had already ended. "She ain't worth much alive," one of them spat. "But she's worth enough." The woman struck him across the face with the back of her hand. Not because she believed she could win, because dignity was the last thing they had failed to steal. The outlaw answered with the butt of his revolver. She fell hard onto the rocks. Ethan never remembered drawing his rifle. The first shot shattered the outlaw's hat before anyone realized another man had entered the canyon. "That's far enough," Ethan said quietly. His voice carried no anger, only certainty. The canyon fell silent except for the restless snorting of frightened horses. For men, one cowboy, no one moved. Dust drifted between them like pale ghosts. "You planning to die for an Apache widow?" the leader sneered. Ethan's finger remained still against the trigger. "No," a pause. "But I don't mind making today expensive for you." Nobody laughed. Something inside the cowboy's eyes convinced them he wasn't bluffing. The leader cursed beneath his breath before jerking his reins. "This ain't over." "It never is," Ethan answered. The riders disappeared into the desert, their hoofbeats fading behind layers of heat and stone. Only then did Ethan lower his rifle. The Apache woman was already struggling to stand despite blood running down one side of her forehead. Every movement was guarded. Every breath carried pain she refused to show. He took one careful step toward her. She instantly reached for a knife hidden beneath her torn clothing. "Don't." The blade trembled in her hand. "I said don't come closer." Ethan stopped exactly where he stood. 20 feet separated them, far enough that she could still believe she controlled her own fate. He removed his canteen and placed it on a flat stone between them. Then he stepped back. "I'll leave it there." She stared at the water, then at him, then back at the water. Slowly, as twilight swallowed the canyon and shadows stretched across the desert floor, she whispered the question that carried the weight of every betrayal she had survived. "Cowboy, do you just want my body like everyone else's?" Ethan did not answer. The question remained between them, heavy as wet leather, refusing to disappear into the desert night. The fire painted slow waves of amber across the sandstone walls while the smell of mesquite smoke drifted into the cool air. Somewhere beyond the canyon, a lone coyote cried toward the moon, and the sound lingered longer than it should have. The Apache widow never lowered the knife. Her fingers were trembling, but not from fear. From memory. Ethan had seen that kind of trembling before. Men returning from war carried it. Children who survived massacres carried it. People whose trust had been buried beside someone they loved carried it. "I don't need your answer," she finally whispered, though her voice betrayed the lie. "Every white man gives the same one." Ethan reached for neither his rifle nor his revolver. Instead, he quietly unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy leather landed beside his saddle with a dull thud. Then came the hunting knife. Then the revolver. Piece by piece, every weapon disappeared from his body until only an exhausted rancher's worn shirt remained between him and the cold night. The Apache woman watched every movement. Confusion flickered across her face. "If I wanted to hurt you," Ethan said softly, "I'd have done it before you woke up." Nothing more. No speech. No defense. Only the truth. Silence settled over the canyon once again. She still refused to drink from the canteen. Instead, She studied him with sharp, suspicious eyes, searching for the hidden price that always followed kindness. She never found it. Her name was Nayeli. 28 winters had passed over her life, though grief had carved another 20 into her face. 3 years earlier, her husband, Taza, had ridden with Apache warriors to protect families fleeing across the mountains. He never returned. Some said soldiers had taken him. Others believed bounty hunters had sold him for gold. No body was ever found. Only his blood-stained turquoise necklace had come home. From that day forward, every stranger seemed to see the same thing when they looked at Nayeli. Not a widow, not a survivor, not a woman, only something they believed could be owned. Some offered protection with wandering hands. Some offered food with impossible conditions. Others skipped the lies altogether. She had escaped every one of them. Each escape left another invisible scar. Across the fire sat Ethan Calloway. Most towns believed he preferred cattle over people. Children waved at him. Adults rarely did. He lived alone on a forgotten ranch north of Dry Creek, where broken fences outnumbered visitors, and the wind knew his name better than any neighbor. People called him stubborn. Some called him dangerous. None of them truly knew him. Years ago, another woman had laughed beside another campfire beneath another desert sky. Her name had been Eleanor. She had worn a silver engagement ring that reflected sunlight like river water. 3 weeks before their wedding, a stagecoach robbery ended with 6 graves. Eleanor rested beneath one of them. The silver ring remained in Ethan's saddlebag, untouched for 7 years. Not because he could not let her go, because every morning it reminded him of one promise. Never use another person's weakness to ease your own loneliness. Never. The fire snapped suddenly. A shower of sparks drifted upward into the darkness. Nayeli flinched before she realized it was only burning wood. Ethan noticed. He said nothing. Instead, he stood slowly, walked several paces away from the fire, and spread his own blanket beneath a twisted juniper tree almost 30 feet from where she rested. Far enough that she could sleep without wondering whether footsteps would wake her before dawn. Before lying down, he placed the last piece of dried venison beside the untouched canteen. Neither gift came with a request. Neither carried a condition. Watching from across the firelight, Nayeli tightened her grip around the knife. For the first time in years, she found herself frightened not by what a man wanted from her, but by the possibility that this one wanted nothing at all. Morning arrived without kindness. Cold desert light slipped over the canyon walls, turning every stone pale silver while the night's warmth disappeared into the endless sky. Ethan woke before sunrise, as he always did. Ranch work had taught him that the world belonged to those willing to greet it before everyone else. He glanced toward the dying campfire. Nayeli was gone. Only the folded blanket remained. The untouched knife marks beside the ashes told him she had left quietly, careful enough not to wake him. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared at the empty place. Then he noticed something else. The dried venison was gone. So was the canteen. The corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. She had not trusted him, but she had trusted the food. Sometimes that was where healing began. He saddled his horse without hurry and continued north toward Dry Creek, following the narrow trail that wound through towering cliffs covered with weathered juniper and twisted cedar. The morning breeze carried the scent of sagebrush, damp earth, and distant rain that would probably never reach the valley. Half an hour later, Buzzard Ridge came into view. His horse stopped before Ethan did. The gelding's ears stood straight. Something wasn't right. The silence. Birds should have been singing. Instead, there was nothing. No wings. No insects. Only wind. Ethan slowly dismounted. His boots sank into reddish dust as he walked toward a patch of broken brush. There. A drop of blood. Then another. Fresh. Dark against the sand. Not an animal's. Human. He crouched, touching the edge of one stain with rough fingertips. Still warm. His eyes followed the scattered trail weaving through the rocks until it disappeared behind a narrow ridge. He already knew whose blood it was. He also knew she had deliberately chosen not to follow his tracks. She had tried to disappear again. A faint sound drifted across the canyon. Not a scream. A gasp. The kind someone made while fighting to stay conscious. Ethan found her beneath the shade of a leaning cottonwood growing beside a narrow stream. Nayeli had collapsed against the trunk, her breathing shallow, one hand pressed tightly over the wound hidden beneath her torn shawl. The cloth around her ribs had turned nearly black. She reached for the knife the moment she saw him. You followed me. No. He knelt several feet away. I followed blood. Her jaw tightened. I don't need saving. I know. Then leave. He looked toward the wound instead of her face. If I leave now. He stopped. There was no need to finish the sentence. She already knew. The fever had begun. Tiny beads of sweat clung to her forehead despite the cool morning air. Her hands shook harder than they had the night before. The blow from the outlaw's revolver had been the smallest of her injuries. The knife hidden beneath her clothing had cut deeper than either of them realized during the escape. Ethan quietly reached into his saddlebag. The instant she saw the white bandages, her eyes widened with panic. No. She backed herself against the tree. Don't touch me. He froze. The bandage remained in his hands. Another silence settled between them, long heavy. Then Ethan did something no man had ever done before. He placed a clean cloth, a needle, thread, a small bottle of whiskey, and a pouch of dried herbs on a flat rock between them. I learned this from the old army doctor at Fort Mason. His voice remained calm. You can stitch it yourself. Confusion spread slowly across Nayeli's face. You aren't going to? He shook his head once. It's your body. You decide who touches it. The words drifted across the quiet stream like falling leaves. For several heartbeats, neither of them moved. Then, without another word, Ethan turned his back to her, walked nearly 40 paces away, and sat facing the opposite direction, giving her the one thing she had not been offered since becoming a widow: privacy. Behind him came the faint sound of trembling hands opening the bandage. Then a muffled cry of pain. Ethan never turned around. But high above the canyon, hidden beyond the cliffs, for distant horsemen had already spotted the thin ribbon of smoke rising from their camp. And one of them smiled. The first rider arrived before noon, not with thundering hooves, with silence. Ethan noticed the reflection first. A brief flash of sunlight dancing across a rifle barrel high on the ridge. He did not reach for his gun. Instead, he calmly poured water into a battered tin cup and set it beside the flat stone where Nayeli had finished stitching her wound. The whiskey bottle remained half full. Blood stained the folded bandages, but the bleeding had finally stopped. You should drink, he said. Nayeli looked at the cup as if it were another trap. What do you want in return? Ethan frowned slightly. In return? She nodded. Nothing is free. The water is. No. Her voice was steady despite the pain. Nothing from your people ever is. The words carried no hatred. Only certainty built from too many disappointments. Ethan let the cup remain where it was. After a moment, he picked it up himself and drank from it before filling it again from the stream. Then he placed it back onto the same stone without another word. Her eyes followed every movement. You think that changes anything? No. Then why do it? So you'll know I didn't poison it. The answer caught her completely unprepared. She had expected excuses, flattery, promises, not simple honesty. Minutes passed before she finally reached for the cup. She drank only one swallow. Small, careful. Yet Ethan noticed something she probably did not. She no longer held the knife while drinking. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant smell of horse sweat. Leather. Gunpowder. Ethan slowly stood. How many? Nayeli asked. At least 4. You can leave. He looked toward the ridge without blinking. They're after me. I know. You don't owe me anything. I know. She stared at him in disbelief. Then why are you still here? Ethan rested one hand lightly on the saddle horn. My father used to say something. What? If a wolf starts chasing the traveler beside you. He paused. It'll eventually chase you too. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she lowered her eyes. The canyon became quiet again. Too quiet. Then a pebble rolled down the cliff. Another. A hawk exploded into the sky from somewhere above. Someone was moving. Ethan gently picked up his rifle. Still, he did not point it toward anyone. Not yet. Across the stream, Nayeli struggled to her feet. Pain crossed her face, but pride refused to let it remain. She reached into the bundle lying beside her and removed a small turquoise pendant hanging from a worn leather cord. Its surface was cracked. One corner stained dark brown long ago. She wrapped it around her wrist instead of her neck. Ethan recognized it immediately, not because he knew Apache customs, because dried blood never truly lost its color. My husband's, she whispered, noticing his eyes. He nodded once. I figured. He died because he believed people could change. She looked directly at him. I stopped believing the day they brought this back. The pendant caught the sunlight. For one brief second, it looked almost beautiful. Then the first rifle shot shattered the stillness. The bullet struck the cottonwood behind Ethan, spraying splinters through the air. His horse reared violently. Another shot followed. Closer. Dust burst at Nayeli's feet. A voice echoed from the ridge. Leave the woman, cowboy. Another voice laughed. We only need her alive. Ethan finally raised his rifle. Not toward the men. Toward the narrow canyon. While above them, Nayeli stared at him in confusion. You're aiming the wrong way. No. His finger tightened slowly against the trigger. I'm aiming at the mountain. The rifle cracked. A heartbeat later, the cliff answered with a deep, terrifying groan. Tiny stones began bouncing down the slope. Then larger ones. The entire ridge started to move. And suddenly, every man on horseback realized they were no longer chasing a widow. They were trying to outrun the mountain itself. The mountain answered with thunder. A wall of rock, dust, and shattered cedar tore loose from the ridge, roaring into the canyon like an angry river. Horses screamed. Men cursed. The ground shook Benet. The rain ended before dawn. Mist drifted between the pine trees, wrapping the abandoned cabin in pale gray silence. Water slipped from the roof one slow drop at a time. Somewhere deep in the forest, a woodpecker struck an old cedar with patient rhythm. Ethan was already awake. He stood outside beside the spring, tightening the saddle on his gelding while the morning air carried the scent of wet earth and pine resin. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Nayeli stepped into the light. Her face looked stronger. The fever had broken. The wound still hurt, but the fire had left her eyes. You should stay another day, Ethan said without turning around. I've stayed too many. He nodded. I figured you'd say that. She hesitated. You aren't coming? I am. She frowned. Why? Because they know you're alive. The words settled heavily between them. Neither needed to ask who they were. The bounty hunters had not crossed half the territory to give up after one landslide. By sunrise, they were riding again. The trail wound through thick timber before opening into rolling meadows where waist-high grass swayed beneath a bright blue sky. Wildflowers colored the hillsides with patches of yellow and violet, almost enough to make a traveler forget how dangerous the frontier truly was. Almost. Around midday, Ethan suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. What is it? Nayeli whispered. He pointed toward the ground. Fresh horseshoes. 6 of them. Not 4. They found more men. Nayeli's hand instinctively reached for the turquoise pendant beneath her shawl. They're getting closer. No. Ethan crouched beside the tracks. They're waiting. She looked around uneasily. For what? For us to choose the easy road. He lifted his eyes toward a broad valley stretching west. The trail looked inviting. Flat. Open. Fast. Too fast. Instead, Ethan turned his horse toward a narrow ridge covered with loose rock and twisted pines. The hard way? Nayeli asked. The living way. They climbed for nearly an hour. The path became so narrow that both riders were forced to dismount and lead their horses across broken stone. Wind rushed through the cliffs, carrying the cries of distant hawks overhead. Then came the gunshot. It echoed once. Twice. The third bullet shattered a pine trunk inches from Ethan's shoulder. They're above us. Nayeli shouted. No. Ethan looked uphill. They're driving us. A second group appeared below. 3 riders. Another above. 3 more. Exactly as he feared. The valley had never been an escape. It had been bait. The leader rode forward until both groups could see one another across the rocky slope. Marshal Clyde Mercer. His polished badge gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. His smile never reached his eyes. There you are, Mercer called calmly. I've been looking for that Apache widow. Nayeli stiffened. A marshal? So they say. Mercer removed a folded document from inside his coat. Federal warrant. He held it high enough for Ethan to see. She's accused of murdering 2 traitors and stealing army property. Nayeli whispered. It's a lie. Ethan already knew. He looked from the paper to the armed men surrounding the ridge. 6 rifles. No witnesses. Too perfect. Mercer smiled again. Step aside, cowboy. I don't think so. You planning to die for someone who isn't even your wife? Ethan's answer came quietly. No. Another pause. I'm planning to live with myself tomorrow. The marshal's smile disappeared. He slowly raised his rifle. So be it. The first bullet struck Ethan before Nayeli even realized Mercer had fired. The impact threw him backward against the rocks. Blood spread across his shirt. His rifle slipped from his hands and tumbled down the slope. For one terrifying heartbeat, the entire mountain became silent. The silence broke with the sound of a heartbeat. Not the mountain, not the wind, Nayeli's. She dropped to her knees beside Ethan before the echo of the rifle had completely faded. Blood seeped through the torn fabric near his left shoulder, spreading slowly across the faded blue shirt he had worn since the first morning she met him. Ethan. He opened one eye. I'm still here. She pressed both hands against the wound without thinking. Only after she touched him did she realize what she had done. For days she had flinched whenever he came within arm's reach. Now her own hands refused to let him go. Marshal Mercer smiled from the ridge above. He's finished. One of the bounty hunters began riding downhill. Mercer raised a hand. No. The riders stopped. Let him bleed. His voice carried easily across the rocks. The woman will surrender before sunset. Nayeli looked toward the ridge. There were too many rifles. Too much open ground. No escape. She lowered her head. I'm sorry. Ethan frowned weakly. For what? For bringing this to you. A faint smile crossed his lips despite the pain. You didn't. The moment you found me. No. His breathing grew heavier. The moment they decided your life had a price. They brought it to both of us. Another shot struck the rocks nearby, scattering chips of granite across the slope. Mercer's men laughed. The sound echoed through the canyon. Nayeli's eyes filled with something she had buried years ago. Not fear. Helplessness. She remembered another hillside. Another afternoon. Her husband surrounded. She had watched from too far away to reach him. She would not watch another good man die. Her fingers tightened around Ethan's shoulder. You should leave me. He slowly shook his head. Can't. You'll die? Maybe. Why? Her voice cracked. Why would you do this for someone you don't even know? Ethan stared toward the endless sky above the ridge. Clouds drifted lazily across the blue, untouched by bullets or hatred. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely louder than the wind. Because. He paused to catch his breath. You're a human being. Nothing more. No grand speech. No promise. No declaration. Only 6 simple words. They struck deeper than every bullet fired that day. Nayeli felt something inside her begin to break. Not her courage. Her certainty. Every man she had known since becoming a widow had first asked what she could give. This man asked nothing, expected nothing, demanded nothing. He had crossed deserts, faced outlaws, stood before rifles, taken a bullet, and never once reached for anything that belonged to her. A warm tear slipped quietly down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. Above them, Mercer grew impatient. Last chance. He cupped his hands around his mouth. Leave the cowboy and walk up here. You have my word you'll live. Neither Ethan nor Nayeli answered. Mercer laughed. My word is worth more than his life. Nayeli slowly reached beneath Ethan's fallen saddlebag, searching for clean bandages. Instead, her fingers touched folded paper wrapped inside an old leather pouch. She hesitated. The paper had partially slipped open during the fall. Across the top, she saw faded handwriting. Not official documents. Not maps. A letter. Beneath it rested the silver ring. The same ring she had seen inside the cabin. Without meaning to, she unfolded the first page. The ink had faded with time, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll never let grief make you hard. The world already has enough cruel men. Stay gentle, even when it hurts. Eleanor Nayeli stopped breathing. She looked from the letter to the wounded cowboy lying beside her. At last she understood. His kindness had never begun with her. It had begun with a promise, made to a woman whose voice had survived long after her heartbeat had not. The letter trembled in Nayeli's hands. Not because of the mountain wind, because everything she had believed about Ethan Calloway had collapsed in a single sentence. Stay gentle, even when it hurts. She carefully folded Eleanor's letter and slipped it back beside the silver ring exactly as she had found it. Some promises deserved to remain untouched. A shadow crossed the rocks. Marshal. Mercer was moving closer. So, he called, his boots scraping across the ridge. Has the hero bled enough? The men around him laughed. Their rifles never lowered. Nayeli looked at Ethan. His breathing had become slower. His shirt was soaked with blood, but his eyes remained calm. You need to leave, he whispered. She shook her head. No. They'll kill you. They already tried. A faint smile touched his face. Stubborn. So I've been told. Another shot struck the stone only a few feet away. Mercer's patience had ended. I'll count to 5. He stepped forward confidently. 1. Nayeli slowly rose to her feet. Not with fear. With purpose. 2. She looked toward the steep eastern ridge. The narrow cliffs beyond were empty. Or so Mercer believed. 3. Nayeli took a deep breath. Then she did something Ethan had never seen before. She lifted both hands toward the sky and released a long, piercing cry. It echoed across the mountains. High, sharp, ancient. Not a scream. A signal. Mercer's smile disappeared. The canyon answered. Once. Then again. From somewhere beyond the cliffs came another call. Then another. And another. Different voices. Different distances. Moving closer. The bounty hunters exchanged uncertain glances. What was that? One whispered. No one answered. The forest itself seemed to awaken. Hawks burst from towering pines. Horses stamped nervously. Even the wind changed direction. Mercer tightened his grip around the rifle. She's bluffing. No one sounded convinced. Moments later, the first rider appeared atop the northern ridge. Then another. Then 5 more. Silent figures wrapped in buckskin sat motionless against the bright afternoon sky. No war cries. No rushing charge. Only stillness. Within seconds, riders appeared on every surrounding ridge. 10, 20, 30. More emerged from the timber below. Others stood among the rocks with bows already drawn. Mercer's men slowly realized they were no longer the hunters. They had become the surrounded. One bounty hunter lowered his rifle. Another quietly backed his horse away. No one gave the order. Fear did. An elderly Apache warrior rode forward from the highest ridge. His long gray braid rested across one shoulder. The eagle feathers behind him barely moved in the wind. His eyes never left Nayeli. She knew him immediately. Chief Ahote, her late husband's uncle. He raised one hand. Every Apache warrior remained perfectly still. His gaze shifted toward Ethan lying wounded among the rocks. Then back to Nayeli. No words. Only one silent question. Why is the white man here? Nayeli looked down at Ethan, then slowly stepped away from him. Mercer's smile returned for a brief, hopeful second, until she turned and placed herself directly between Ethan and every rifle on the mountain. She stood there alone, facing her own people, facing the bounty hunters, facing every judgment waiting to be spoken. Then, in a voice steady enough for the entire valley to hear, she said, "He never touched me." She paused. The wind carried the words across the cliffs. "Except to save my life." Silence followed. No bird sang. No horse moved. Even Marshal Mercer forgot to breathe. Chief Ahote studied Ethan for several long moments. Then his weathered eyes fell upon the blood soaking the cowboy's shirt. Without speaking, the old chief slowly dismounted. One by one, every Apache warrior around the valley lowered their weapons. Not in surrender, in respect. And for the first time since this journey had begun, Nayeli realized the greatest battle Ethan had fought was never against guns. It had always been against the world's refusal to believe that kindness could exist without a price. Marshal Clyde Mercer never reached for his rifle. He reached for his pride. Looking across the valley at dozens of silent Apache warriors, he finally understood that bullets would not save him now. Men who had laughed only moments earlier slowly lowered their eyes. Horses shifted uneasily beneath them. Even the mountain wind seemed unwilling to stand beside men whose courage vanished the moment they lost the advantage. Chief Ahote took one slow step toward Mercer. No threats, no shouting, only the weight of a man who had buried too many sons to fear another gun. "You carry a badge," the old chief said quietly, "but not honor." The words landed harder than any fist. Mercer looked toward Ethan, still lying against the rocks. "You believe him over your own enemies?" Chief Ahote turned his weathered face toward Nayeli. "I believe the woman who has never lied to me." Then he looked back at Mercer. "And I believe the man who bled when he could have ridden away." Mercer's jaw tightened. He understood there would be no victory left to steal. One by one, his bounty hunters backed their horses down the slope. No shots were fired. No final duel stained the mountain. For once, the day belonged to restraint instead of revenge. As the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge, Ethan's strength finally gave way. His eyes closed. The world faded into darkness. When he opened them again, the smell of burning cedar filled the air. A lodge roof stretched above him, woven from timber and bark. Late afternoon sunlight slipped through narrow openings, painting golden lines across the floor. His shoulder burned. Someone had cleaned the wound. Someone had stitched it properly. He turned his head. Nayeli sat beside the doorway, quietly weaving fresh leather around the cracked turquoise pendant. When she noticed his eyes open, she smiled. Not the cautious smile of a frightened widow. The peaceful smile of someone who had finally laid down a burden too heavy to carry alone. "You've been asleep 3 days," she said softly. Ethan tried to sit up. She gently rested one hand against his uninjured shoulder. Not yet. For the first time, he did not pull away. Outside, children laughed somewhere among the pines. Women prepared evening meals. Old men repaired saddles beneath the fading sun. Life moved without fear. Chief Ahote entered the lodge carrying Ethan's saddlebag. He placed it carefully beside the bed. Nothing was missing. Not the silver ring. Not Eleanor's letter. "I was wrong about your people," the old chief admitted. Ethan looked at him quietly. "So was I." The chief nodded once. Sometimes wisdom needed no longer conversation. Several weeks passed before Ethan was strong enough to leave. His horse stood ready at sunrise. Mist drifted lazily across the valley while dew shimmered on tall grass like scattered silver. Nayeli walked beside him to the edge of the trail. Neither hurried to speak. Some farewells deserved silence first. Finally, she reached beneath her shawl. Not for the turquoise pendant. For another piece of cloth. It was the black mourning veil she had worn since the day Taza never came home. She folded it carefully, then placed it inside Ethan's saddlebag beside Eleanor's letter. "I don't need this anymore," she whispered. Ethan looked at her. "And your husband?" She smiled gently toward the rising sun. "I stopped honoring him with my grief." She placed one hand over her heart. "I honor him by living." The morning breeze carried the scent of pine, fresh earth, and distant rain. Ethan mounted his horse. For a moment, neither moved. Then Nayeli stepped closer. Not close enough to embrace him. Only close enough to let the truth reach him. "I asked if you wanted my body." Her voice trembled only slightly. "I was asking the wrong question." She looked into his eyes. "You protected something no one else ever saw." A quiet tear slipped down her cheek. "My dignity." Ethan removed his hat. No speech followed. None was needed. He gently touched 2 fingers to the brim before turning his horse toward the open frontier. Nayeli watched until horse and rider became one small silhouette against the endless horizon. Long after he disappeared, the valley remained silent. Because out on the frontier, the greatest men were never remembered for how many lives they took. They were remembered for the lives they refused to own. And sometimes, the strongest kind of love was simply leaving another soul freer than you found it.